The early morning light bled through the curtains, casting long, pale shadows across the room. Taeyoung stirred, her body stiff from the tension of the night. She sat up slowly, realizing with a jolt of relief that the bed beside her was empty. Jungkook was already up, standing near the window. He wasn't in a suit. Today, he wore a sharp, black, long-sleeved shirt that clung to his broad shoulders and fitted dark denim jeans. The casual look somehow made him appear more dangerous, more grounded in his power. He was scrolling through something on his phone, his expression unreadable. He glanced toward the bed, catching her gaze in the reflection of the glass. Jungkook, up at last. Good. We leave in 20 minutes. He turned and strode out of the room, his footsteps echoing on the floor. The moment the door clicked shut, Taeyoung let out a frantic, silent prayer. Taeyoung, oh God, please, please let this trip be boring. Let him have back-to-back meetings. Let him be distracted by work. Let him forget whatever punishment he's thinking of. Just make him busy, make him tired, make him anything but focused on me. Please, I'll be good. I'll do anything. Just give me a week of peace. She scrambled out of bed, her hands shaking as she pulled her suitcase open. She needed something comfortable, something that felt like a shield. She bypassed the elegant outfits she had packed the night before and pulled out a pair of light blue palazzo jeans and a soft, oversized white hoodie. As she slipped into them, she caught her reflection. She looked small, almost like she was trying to hide inside the layers of fabric. The door handle turned. Taeyoung froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jungkook walked back in, his eyes sweeping over her from head to toe. He paused, his gaze lingering on the casual, oversized fit of her clothes. A slow, amused smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. He stepped closer, invading her space until she was forced to look up at him. Jungkook, comfortable? He reached out, his thumb tracing the soft material of her hoodie near her collarbone, his touch lingering in a way that made her breath hitch. Jungkook, it doesn't matter what you wear, Taeyoung. You're still coming with me, and I think we both know that no matter how much you try to hide in those clothes, you're not going to be able to hide from me. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur that vibrated against her skin. Jungkook, the car is waiting. Let's go. He didn't wait for an answer, his hand moving to the small of her back to guide her toward the door. Taeyoung took one last shaky breath, realizing her silent prayers had done nothing to stop the inevitable, and followed him out into the hallway. The walk to the car felt like a blur of nerve and suppressed panic. Taeyoung clutched the strap of her small carry-on bag, her knuckles white, while Jungkook walked beside her with a maddeningly relaxed, predatory grace. He seemed completely unaffected by the atmosphere, his hand resting firmly on the back of her hoodie, guiding her through the house as if she were a precious, fragile possession that could not be allowed to drift even an inch away from him. They reached the waiting black sedan. The driver held the door open, his gaze fixed respectfully on the ground. Jungkook paused before ushering her in, his hand sliding from her back to her nape, his fingers tangling into her hair for a brief, possessive squeeze. Jungkook, eyes up, Taeyoung. You're going to give everyone the impression that you're being dragged to the guillotine instead of Paris. His voice was light, almost conversational, but the underlying threat was crystal clear. She forced her chin up, masking her terror with a brittle, fragile mask of compliance. Taeyoung, I'm just tired, Jungkook. Jungkook, well, you can rest on the plane. Or not. He chuckled, a low sound that sent a shiver down her spine. I'm sure I'll find plenty of ways to keep you occupied. He nudged her forward and she slid into the leather interior immediately, sliding as far toward the opposite window as the seat belt would allow. Jungkook followed, his larger frame making the car feel suddenly intimate, even suffocating. As the engine purred to life and the estate gates began to pull away, Taeyoung stared out at the passing trees, praying for the city to move faster, for the airport to appear anything to break the tension. Jungkook leaned back, his phone nowhere in sight. He didn't work. He didn't check his emails. He simply watched her, his dark eyes tracing the line of her throat, the way she was biting her lip, the way she refused to turn her head. He got an idea to make her scared and smirked and, "Jungkook, you know, there's a part of me that really likes this version of you." He reached out, his hand sliding across the seat to rest over her knee, his thumb tracing the fabric of her palazzo jeans. He reached out, his hand sliding across the seat to rest over her knee, his thumb tracing the fabric of her palazzo jeans. Jungkook, so quiet, so observant, so afraid. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that made the chauffeur's presence feel non-existent. "It makes the anticipation so much sweeter. Just wait until we're at 30,000 feet, and there's absolutely nowhere for you to go." Taeyoung squeezed her eyes shut, a silent plea for composure, but his touch burned through the denim, a searing reminder that the game had only just begun. Blurred scenery, but her mind was a tempest of regret. Her gaze remained fixed on the window, but internally she was screaming at herself. Why, Taeyoung? Why couldn't you just keep your mouth shut? The memory of that night, the night that had ignited this entire descent into madness, replayed in her head like a recurring nightmare. She remembered the warmth of the wine, the way her inhibitions had dissolved, and the foolish, liquid courage that had convinced her it was the perfect time to finally speak her mind. She had been so sure that she was standing up for herself, that she was finally setting boundaries. Instead, she had just handed Jungkook the leash. "You were an idiot," she scolded herself, her fingernails digging into the palm of her hand inside her hoodie pocket. "You let yourself get drunk, you let your tongue run loose, and you dared to challenge him in front of everyone. What did you expect, you fool? You aren't a rebel. You're just a target now." She winced internally as the specific phrases she'd slurred out that night echoed in her memory, the defiance, the accusations, the way she had looked him in the eye and thought she was winning. It had been a catastrophic miscalculation. She hadn't broken his hold on her. She had only made him interested in tightening it. She felt a fresh wave of bitterness toward her own fate. She wasn't born for this kind of game, the psychological chess, the calculated cruelty, the constant suffocating surveillance. She had just wanted a quiet life, but one bad night and a few reckless words had shattered that peace completely. Now, every time Jungkook moved in the seat beside her, or his hand shifted slightly on her knee, she felt the weight of those consequences. It was a prison built of her own making, brick by brick, word by intoxicated word. If I could just go back, she thought, her chest aching with the futility of it. If I could just go back and stay silent. If I could have just been the good wife. For one more night, I'd be in my bed at home right now, not heading toward an unknown hell in Paris. But the car was moving faster, the airport signs beginning to appear on the horizon. There was no going back. There was only the destination and the man beside her who was watching her internal spiral with the terrifying, patient hunger of a predator who knew exactly how much she was suffering and loved every second of it. The car came to a smooth stop at the private terminal entrance. Taeyoung didn't move at first, paralyzed by the sight of the sleek jet waiting on the tarmac. It looked like a gleaming silver needle, ready to stitch her fate to his for the next several hours. Jungkook stepped out, his movements fluid and efficient. He didn't wait for her. He walked around the car, opened her door, and offered a hand that she had no choice but to take. His grip was firm, pulling her out of the vehicle and into the cool morning air. He didn't bother with the porters. He grabbed her small suitcase and his own garment bag with one hand, his other hand immediately finding the small of her back. The touch was possessive, a silent command that kept her tethered to his side. As they walked toward the plane, the wind whipped at her white hoodie, making her feel even smaller. She kept her head down, counting the cracks in the pavement, trying to ground herself. "Jungkook, look up, Taeyoung." His voice was a low murmur, but it carried the weight of an iron decree. Taeyoung lifted her chin, her eyes darting toward the plane. A flight attendant stood at the bottom of the stairs, a polite, practiced smile on her face. As they approached, the woman bowed slightly, her eyes flickering with a mix of professional deference and curiosity at the couple. Jungkook didn't acknowledge her beyond a curt nod. He steered Taeyoung toward the stairs, his hand sliding up to her shoulder, his fingers digging in, just enough to remind her that she was his responsibility and his property for the duration of this flight. Every step up the metal stairs felt like walking toward a cage. The realization hit her again. There were no sisters here to bridge the gap, no brothers to lighten the mood, and no parents to act as a buffer. Just her, Jungkook, and the thousands of feet of altitude between her and the world she knew. As she reached the top of the stairs and stepped into the plush, dimly lit cabin, she felt a wave of nausea. She turned to look back at the runway for a fleeting second, a desperate, silent goodbye to her freedom, before Jungkook nudged her forward, his hand steady and unyielding on her back, ushering her into the cabin and sealing her fate. Taeyoung immediately moved toward the window seat, eager to press herself into the corner and put as much distance between herself and the cabin door as possible. But the illusion of space vanished the moment Jungkook sat down right next to her. The plush leather seats were large, yet he positioned himself so close that his broad shoulder brushed against hers, his long legs and the dark denim easily dominating the space. As the jet began to taxi down the runway, the low, powerful rumble of the engines vibrated through the floorboards. Taeyoung gripped the armrest, her eyes wide as she stared out at the ground, moving faster and faster. Then came the sudden, sharp tilt. The nose of the plane lifted, and the heavy force of gravity pushed her back into her seat as they accelerated into the sky. The abrupt sensation of leaving the ground triggered a sudden spike of panic, forgetting her anger, forgetting her regrets, and acting purely on instinct. Taeyoung's hand darted across the space between them and gripped Jungkook's hand. Her fingers dug into his palm, her knuckles turning white as she sought anything stable to hold on to. Jungkook didn't flinch. Instead, a slow, soft expression crossed his face, his dark eyes fixed on her panicked profile. He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers, and locking them together with a firm, unyielding grip. With his other hand, he reached around her waist, pulling her flush against his side until she was completely tucked under his chest. "Jungkook, I've got you, Taeyoung. Look at me, I'm right next to you." His voice was low, smooth, and surprisingly loving, losing its mocking edge, for a moment to offer a deep, grounding assurance. He squeezed her hand firmly, his thumb rubbing comforting circles across the back of her hand, anchoring her against the turbulence of the ascent. Taeyoung looked up at him, her breath coming in short, quick, shallow puffs. Being held so tightly against him brought an overwhelming rush of conflicting emotions. As the plane leveled out into the clouds, a strange, dizzying cocktail of excitement and terror washed over her. There was an undeniable thrill to the sheer speed, the luxury, and the intense, undivided attention he was showering her with. Yet, right beneath that thrill lay the sharp, chilling reminder of why they were on this flight. The anticipation of what he called her punishment loomed large, making her heart race for entirely different reasons. She was completely caught in his web, frightened of what Paris held, yet entirely consumed by the intoxicating weight of his presence. Slowly, as the panic of the takeoff began to fade into a dull hum, the exhaustion of the sleepless night caught up to her. Her rigid posture softened. She didn't pull away from his grip. Instead, she leaned her head sideways, letting it rest heavily against Jungkook's broad shoulder. Jungkook didn't move. He simply shifted slightly to accommodate her weight, his arm tightening around her waist in a quiet, possessive embrace, keeping her pinned to his side as the plane carried them higher and further away from safety. The silence of the cabin was broken only by the steady, rhythmic drone of the jet engines, a sound that seemed to isolate them from the rest of the world. Taeyoung felt the barrier between them, the solid, cold armrest, give way, with a soft, mechanical click as Jungkook pressed a button. He didn't hesitate. With one fluid motion, he pulled her closer, eliminating the last few inches of air that remained between them. Her body melted into his side, finding an unexpected but absolute comfort in his strength. She shifted, settling her head deep into the crook of his shoulder, her own arms coming to rest naturally across his lap. The fabric of his black shirt felt cool against her skin, and the scent of him was all-consuming. She felt his hand come up to settle on her back, his fingers tracing the soft material of her white hoodie with a slow, deliberate touch. It was a gesture that managed to be both deeply possessive and strangely soothing, a calculated contrast to the looming tension of the days ahead. The fear she had felt earlier, the sharp, piercing terror of the punishment, was still there, buried deep in her chest, but it was now laced with an addictive, dizzying sense of surrender. She was his, entirely and completely. And for these few hours in the sky, there was nowhere left to run. Jungkook tilted his head, his lips grazing the top of her hair. He didn't speak with the sharp, mocking tone he'd used earlier. Instead, his voice was a low, resonant rumble against her temple, soft and heavy with promise. "Jungkook, sleep, sweetheart." He kept his hand pressed firmly against her back, anchoring her to him, his presence a constant, heavy shield. As his thumb traced lazy, hypnotic patterns against her shoulder, the exhaustion finally claimed her. She closed her eyes, the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest beneath her head, lulling her into the very sleep he had demanded, knowing that when she woke, the real game would begin. The cabin air was cool and crisp, but Taeyoung felt none of it. Cocooned in, the overwhelming warmth radiating from Jungkook, the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beneath her ear acted like a metronome, slow and hypnotic, anchoring her to the present moment. Jungkook didn't stop moving his hand. His palm remained firm against her back, his fingers occasionally sliding up to the nape of her neck, gently massaging the tense muscles there. It was a strange, disorienting experience, being treated with such deliberate, almost tender care by the same man who had engineered her entire loss of autonomy. She felt his other hand drift from her waist to rest securely over her arms, which were still folded across his lap. His fingers were long and warm, and he held her hands captive beneath his own, effectively pinning her to him. There was no room for her to fidget, no space for her to retreat. She was entirely enveloped by him. As the minutes bled into hours, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft, ambient glow. Most of the flight crew had retreated to the galley, leaving them in a private, suspended reality. Jungkook remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the seat back in front of them, though he wasn't really looking at it. He was focused entirely on her, his expression one of quiet, predatory satisfaction. He watched the way her breathing deepened in sleep, the way she had finally stopped fighting and allowed herself to be molded against him. He leaned his head back against the seat, his own eyes drifting shut for a moment, but his hand never left her. He seemed to be savoring the quiet victory of the moment, the way he had successfully dismantled her resistance and replaced it with this fragile, exhausted compliance. To anyone watching, they looked like the perfect, affectionate couple, drifting through the clouds in a bubble of luxury. But for Taeyoung, even in her sleep, the weight of his grip remained a constant reminder. He was holding her, close not just to comfort her, but to ensure she knew exactly where she belonged. He hummed a low, almost imperceptible melody, his fingers continuing their rhythmic, possessive stroking. He wasn't just letting her sleep, he was keeping her under his spell, ensuring that when she finally opened her eyes, she would wake up in a world where he was the only thing that mattered. The hours spent in the air seemed to exist outside of time, a serene, suspended reality high above the clouds. The earlier tension, the sharp, fearful anticipation of a punishment had completely dissolved, replaced by an unexpected and genuine softness. It was as if, in the quiet isolation of the jet, the friction between them had simply worn away. Taeyoung stirred, her eyes fluttering open to the soft, diffused light of the cabin. She didn't feel the usual spike of panic upon waking. Instead, she felt anchored. She was still tucked into the curve of Jungkook's side, her arms resting on his lap. He had moved his hand to stroke her hair, his touch lingering and gentle, lacking the possessive edge it had held that morning. Jungkook looked down, catching her movement. His expression wasn't the sharp, smirking gaze of a predator, but something far more unguarded, almost affectionate. "Jungkook, you slept for a long time," he murmured, his voice velvety and devoid of any mockery. He reached up, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair away from her forehead with a tenderness that made Taeyoung's heart ache in a completely different way. Taeyoung shifted, tilting her head to look up at him. She felt dazed, a strange, floaty sense of peace settling over her. She reached up, her own fingers hesitantly tracing the line of his jaw. The game they had been playing, the power struggle, the threats, it all felt like a distant, irrelevant memory from a different life. "Taeyoung, I didn't mean to," she whispered, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Jungkook chuckled softly, a warm, resonant sound that vibrated through his chest. He pulled her slightly closer, pressing a lingering, soft kiss to her temple. The air between them felt light, intimate, and profoundly sweet. "Jungkook, it's fine. You needed the rest." He shifted, his hand moving to gently rub her back, his touch relaxed and comforting. They were just two people, sharing a quiet, private moment in the sky. For now, the weight of their roles, the captor and the captive, had evaporated. There was no need to speak of meetings, of rules, or of discipline. There was only the quiet hum of the plane, the warmth of their bodies pressed together, and an easy, tender chemistry that felt far more intoxicating than the fear had ever been. Taeyoung closed her eyes again, letting out a contented sigh. She didn't want to think about the landing or the days to come. She only wanted to stay in this suspended, lovely moment, wrapped in the warmth of the man who, for the first time, felt like a partner rather than a jailer. The smooth hum of the jet engines began to drop in pitch, a subtle shift that signaled their descent. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their arrival into Paris, but the sound felt miles away. Taeyoung lifted her head from Jungkook's shoulder, blinking as the cabin light seemed brighter, clearer. The clouds beneath them had parted, revealing the sprawling, intricate tapestry of the city below, a vast grid of history and light that she had only ever imagined. She felt a squeeze on her shoulder, firm and grounding. Jungkook was looking down at her, his expression a mixture of calm focus and a lingering, quiet warmth from their hours of rest. "Jungkook, we're here, Tae." The nickname sounded crisp and intimate in the quiet cabin, a perfect contrast to the sweetheart he'd used earlier. It felt like a tether, keeping her anchored as the reality of the landing began to set in. Taeyong sat up, smoothing the fronts of her white hoodie, her heart fluttering not with the dread of the morning, but with a genuine, fluttering anticipation. She looked out the window as the landing gear groaned and lowered into place, the sprawling city growing larger and more detailed with every passing second. Jungkook didn't let go of her, though. He kept his hand firmly on her waist, pulling her back against his side as the plane began its final approach. He seemed to be savoring the final moments of their private bubble before the rest of the world rushed back in. "Jungkook, are you ready?" He wasn't asking if she was ready for the flight to end. He was asking if she was ready for this, for them, for the city, and for the promise of the time they were about to spend together. Taeyong looked at him, her eyes searching his face and finding only that same quiet, steady assurance. She realized then that she wasn't just ready. She was excited to step off this plane and into whatever life they were about to build in this new, foreign place. "Taeyong, I am Kook." As the plane touched down on the runway, the tires meeting the tarmac with a smooth, decisive thud, Jungkook leaned in and pressed one last brief kiss to her temple. He stood up, but he didn't release her hand, pulling her up to stand beside him. They walked toward the cabin door together, hand in hand, leaving behind the turbulence of their past and stepping out into the crisp, expectant air of Paris. The private terminal was a world away from the chaotic hustle of the main airport. As they stepped off the jet and onto the cool, polished tarmac, the crisp Parisian air hit them, a sharp, refreshing contrast to the recycled atmosphere of the cabin. Taeyong took a deep, steadying breath, still feeling the lingering warmth of Jungkook's hand in hers. He didn't let go. He held her firmly, guiding her down the portable stairs with a protective, almost possessive grace. A sleek black limousine was already waiting, the chauffeur standing at attention by the open door. Jungkook walked her toward the car, but halfway across the tarmac he stopped. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting a golden, honeyed light over the city's skyline in the distance. He turned to her, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "Jungkook, look, Tae." He gestured toward the horizon, where the distant silhouette of the Eiffel Tower peeked out above the cityscape, glowing faintly in the fading light. It was breathtaking, a sprawling vista that seemed to promise 1,000 different stories. Taeyong felt a swell of genuine wonder. She leaned slightly into him, her hand tightening around his. The city looked like a painting, rich with history and secrets, and the overwhelming fear that had consumed her just hours ago felt like a distant, faded echo. "Taeyong, it's beautiful," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. Jungkook's gaze wasn't on the skyline, though. It was fixed on her, his eyes, dark and intent, tracing the way the golden light caught the softness of her features. He reached up, his thumb brushing her cheek, his touch lingering, in a way that felt entirely grounding. "Jungkook, I told you, but it's only the beginning." He nudged her gently toward the limousine as they slid into the cool, leather-lined interior. The quiet luxury of the car surrounded them, isolating them once more. The chauffeur closed the door, sealing them into their own private world, and the vehicle pulled away from the terminal, merging into the flowing traffic of the city. Taeyong turned to look out the window, watching the narrow, stone-paved streets and the elegant, historic buildings flash by. She felt Jungkook's presence beside her, a steadying weight, his arm draped across the back of her seat, his fingers occasionally brushing her shoulder. She turned back to him, meeting his steady gaze. The journey was over, but as the car carried them deeper into the heart of Paris, she realized she wasn't just a passenger in his life anymore. She was a witness to his world, and for the first time, she was entirely, breathlessly ready to see where it would take her. The city lights shimmered like fallen stars as their limousine navigated the historic streets, finally coming to a stop before the grand entrance of an exclusive hotel. The lobby was a sanctuary of hushed marble and golden light, but Jungkook didn't pause for the formalities. He kept his hand firmly on the small of her back, guiding her toward a private elevator that whisked them straight to the top floor. When the door slid open, Taeyoung's breath hitched. The suite was a masterpiece of refined intimacy. It was bathed in the warm, honeyed glow of a crackling fireplace, the flames dancing against walls, draped in soft, cream-colored velvet and rich mahogany accents. Plush, oversized armchairs were arranged near the fire, piled high with cashmere, throws that invited them to curl up and disappear. The air carried a faint, soothing scent of sandalwood and fresh lilies, and low, ambient jazz drifted softly through the hidden speakers, layering the room in a sense of timeless calm. But it was the far wall that demanded her attention. It was composed entirely of floor-to-ceiling glass, acting as a massive, cinematic frame for the city. And there, standing as the undisputed centerpiece of the night, was the Eiffel Tower. It rose up against the velvet dark of the Parisian sky, its iron lattice glowing with a brilliant golden magic that seemed to pulse in time with the city's heartbeat. The view was so close, so perfectly unobstructed, that it felt as though she could reach out through the glass and touch the shimmering structure. Taeyoung walked toward the window, her steps slow and reverent. The plush, deep-piled carpet felt like a cloud beneath her feet. Jungkook followed, his presence warm and grounding as he circled his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He didn't speak. He simply let her take it all in. They stood there, perfectly still, silhouetted against the iconic skyline. Taeyoung, it feels like we're the only two people in the world, kook. Jungkook rested his chin on her shoulder, his eyes fixed on the display outside before shifting to her reflection in the glass. He kissed the side of her neck, a slow, lingering touch that made the romantic atmosphere of the suite feel even more intense. Jungkook, that's exactly how I wanted it to be. He turned her around, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones. The room was so cozy, so undeniably intimate, that the thought of the punishment or their earlier struggles felt entirely impossible here. It was a space designed for softness, for connection, and for the two of them to finally leave the rest of the world behind. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. Jungkook, no phones, no work, no outside world. We're miles away from the noise of Seoul, and tonight, all we have to do is enjoy the view. Taeyoung smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that lit up her face as she looked up at him. She knew they were a long way from the frantic pace of their home and in this quiet, romantic sanctuary overlooking the most beautiful city in the world. She was finally ready to let go of everything else. Jungkook took her hand and led her away from the window, guiding her toward the velvet-covered sofa near the warmth of the hearth. He sat down, pulling her onto his lap so she was facing him, her legs draped over the side of the chair. In this soft, dim light, the sharp edges of his personality had completely vanished, replaced by an intensity that was focused entirely on her. He reached up, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her jawline. Jungkook, you've been so quiet since we landed, TA. Still thinking about Seoul? Taeyoung shook her head slowly, her eyes searching his. She traced the line of his black shirt, feeling the solid, rhythmic beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. Taeyoung, no. Seoul feels like a dream. Everything there is so fast, so demanding. Here, ... It feels like time has finally slowed down for us. She leaned in, resting her forehead against his. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across their faces. The room felt like a cocoon, isolating them from the bustling city outside. For all the fear she had carried on the plane, the reality of this moment was far more disarming. It wasn't a trap. It felt like an invitation. Jungkook. That's because it has, he whispered, his voice dropping to a low, melodic hum. I wanted to give us a place where the only thing that mattered was what we had in front of us. He tilted his head, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes. He didn't rush. He seemed to be savoring the way she was looking at him, not with defiance, not with fear, but with a growing, soft curiosity that mirrored his own. Jungkook, do you want to see the rest of the suite, or are you happy right here? Taeyoung let out a soft, breathy laugh, her hands coming up to rest on his shoulders. She felt light, untethered from all the worries she had brought with her from home. Taeyoung, I'm happy right here, kook. He smiled, a genuine, private expression that was meant only for her. He leaned in, closing the final inch between them, his kiss slow and deliberate, a quiet promise that for the rest of this night, the only thing that existed was the two of them, the warmth of the fire, and the golden lights of Paris, shimmering through the glass. The evening passed in a blissful haze of shared wine and quiet conversation, their earlier apprehensions replaced by an easy, burgeoning intimacy. As the last course of their room service dinner was cleared away, Jungkook pulled her into a long, lingering embrace before finally glancing at the clock. Jungkook, we have a big day of exploring tomorrow, TA. I think we should get some rest so we're ready to see the sights early. Taeyoung nodded, feeling a wave of genuine contentment. She watched as he headed toward the walk-in dressing room to change into his nightwear. As the door clicked shut, the silence of the suite enveloped her. Suddenly, the memory of the punishment flashed back, the dark threats he had made on the plane, the way he had spoken of making her pay for her rebellion back in Seoul. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. She had been so sure he'd forgotten, or that the romantic atmosphere of Paris had softened his resolve completely. A long, shaky sigh of relief escaped her lungs. He didn't seem to be thinking about it at all. She turned away, needing a moment to process the fading fear. She walked toward the balcony doors and pushed them open. The cool night air of Paris hit her face, crisp and scented with the city's unique blend of stone and rain. Below, the streets were still alive with the hum of traffic and the distant murmur of people walking along the Seine. She gripped the wrought iron railing, leaning forward to get a better look at the Eiffel Tower. It was even more magnificent from out here, a towering, glowing beacon against the midnight blue of the sky. She stood there for a long time, watching the rhythmic pulse of the lights and the steady flow of cars, moving like rivers of gold through the city veins. She felt safe. She felt like she had finally navigated the storm and arrived in the calm. She looked back toward the suite, toward the dressing room door, feeling a strange new sense of hope. If he had forgotten the punishment now, surely by tomorrow, it would be nothing more than a bad memory. The cool night air brushed against her skin, but it was nothing compared to the sudden, grounding heat that settled against her back. Before she could process the movement, strong arms slid around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. Taeyoung flinched, a sharp, involuntary gasp escaping her lips as her heart hammered against her ribs. The sudden contact shattered the fragile peace she had been building in the silence. Jungkook didn't pull away. Instead, he let out a low, grounding hum against Her skin. He leaned in further, tucking his face into the warm, sensitive crook of her neck. His stubble grazed her collarbone, a deliberate, grounding sensation that sent a shiver racing down her spine. He held her there, immobile, his body a solid wall of strength against the backdrop of the city lights. "Jungkook, you're trembling, TA?" His voice was a low, vibrating murmur, barely audible over the distant roar of Parisian traffic below. He didn't move his face, his lips brushing against the sensitive pulse point at the base of her throat, his breath hot against her skin. "Jungkook, what were you thinking about, baby? You looked so serious out here watching the lights." He tightened his arms, his fingers splaying across her stomach effectively, pinning her to the balcony railing. His touch wasn't harsh, but it was undeniably possessive, a silent reminder that even while she was staring at the beauty of the city, she was still securely within his grasp. Taeyong swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the glowing iron structure of the tower. She couldn't tell him she had been thinking about his punishment, that she had been foolish enough to believe it was forgotten. "Taeyong, nothing," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. "Just ... how quiet it is. I was just taking it all in." Jungkook's hand moved slowly, tracing a lazy, teasing pattern against her hoodie. "Jungkook, is that right?" He pulled her even closer, his tone shifting, that low, dangerous, knowing edge returning, the one that made her blood run cold. "Jungkook, because you looked like you were waiting for something, or maybe ... afraid of it." A dark, knowing smirk tugged at the corner of Jungkook's lips. He could feel the way her pulse jumped against his throat, and he read her internal panic as clearly as if she'd spoken it aloud. He didn't need her to confess. He already knew she had been wondering if he'd forgotten his promise. He let out a short, amused huff against her skin, his eyes glinting with a mix of indulgence and hidden intent. "Jungkook, let's go to bed, Tae." Before she could find her voice, he shifted his grip. With a sudden, assertive movement, he turned her around, his hands sliding firmly over the curve of her hips to scoop her up. He didn't just lift her, he settled his palms directly onto the firm, rounded swell of her ass, his fingers digging in with a possessive strength. Taeyong gasped, a sharp, startled sound that hung in the night air. Her reflexes kicked in instantly, her legs instinctively wrapping around his waist and her arms locking tightly around his neck to steady herself. Seeing the sheer shock plastered across her face, her eyes wide, lips parted in surprise, Jungkook's resolve flickered. He gave her ass a deliberate, firm squeeze. Taeyong let out another ragged, breathless gasp, her head falling back against his shoulder. The intensity of his touch, so bold and unapologetic, sent a jolt of heat straight through her, completely bypassing her fear. Jungkook's eyes darkened, a low, rumbling chuckle escaping his chest as he watched her reaction. He couldn't help it. The way she melted into him, despite her shock, was exactly what he wanted. He leaned down, capturing her parted lips in a smooth, lingering kiss that tasted like the expensive wine they'd had for dinner. He didn't wait for her to recover. Carrying her with effortless strength, he turned away from the balcony, the city lights fading behind them as he walked back into the warmth of the suite. He moved with a predator's grace, heading straight for the massive, plush bed, his eyes never leaving hers, fully aware that the quiet, romantic night was about to take a turn she wouldn't be able to escape. Jungkook settled onto the expansive, soft mattress, carefully laying Taeyong down before maneuvering himself to lie directly behind her. He pulled the heavy, luxurious duvet up, tucking it snugly around them, until they were completely cocooned in warmth. He wrapped his arms around her frame, pulling her flush against his body so there wasn't a single inch of space left between them. "Jungkook, good night, baby. Sleep well." His voice was a low velvet rumble that seemed to vibrate through the bed itself. Taeyoung felt a rush of genuine affection wash over her, the earlier shock of his arrival now replaced by a deep sense of security. She smiled against the pillow, shifting back until her spine was pressed firmly against his chest. Taeyoung, night, koo. She barely had the words out before Jungkook's hand slid upward, slipping beneath the hem of her oversized white hoodie. His palm was warm, his skin slightly rough against her soft stomach, and he began to move his hand in. Slow, deliberate, smoothing circles. The sensation was electric, a jolt that started in her belly and radiated outward, making her breath hitch. It was an incredibly intimate, grounding touch that made her feel cherished. As he continued the rhythmic, soothing motion, her defenses completely crumbled. The lingering tension in her shoulders melted away, replaced by a heavy, languid exhaustion. She let out a soft, contented sigh, turning her head slightly to nuzzle into his arm. Jungkook just held her closer, his thumb grazing the soft skin of her waist, his breathing evening out into a steady, calm rhythm. Surrounded by the warmth of the bed and the comforting weight of his touch, the world outside the city, the skyline, the tomorrow they had planned, faded into nothingness. She felt herself drifting, his steady hand on her stomach, anchoring her into a deep, dreamless sleep. The silence in the suite was profound, broken only by the rhythmic, steady sound of their breathing and the distant, muted pulse of the city lights reflecting against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Jungkook didn't stop the motion of his hand. His fingers continued to trace those hypnotic, slow circles across her stomach, his palm radiating a heat that felt like a brand. He stayed perfectly still, his chin resting near the top of her head, his eyes open, staring into the dim shadows of the room. He wasn't sleeping. He was watching her, studying the way she had surrendered, the way her breathing had finally smoothed out into the deep, rhythmic cadence of true rest. He thought back to that night in Seoul, the way she had been so intoxicated. Her words sharp and fearless as she'd intimidated him, challenging him in a way no one else dared. He had controlled his desire then, locking away his hunger because he wouldn't take advantage of her in that state, even during their heated fight. He had forgiven her for the things she'd said, knowing the alcohol had been speaking for her. But the memory of morning stung far worse. When she woke up, she hadn't remembered a single thing from that night. Instead, she had looked at his chest and neck covered in the deep, bruising hickeys she had gifted him in her drunken haze, and had the audacity to accuse him of being with someone else. She had looked at her own work and spat accusations, refusing to believe the truth, even when he tried to tell her. He felt a dark, possessive satisfaction in his chest. He loved her with a ferocity that bordered on terrifying, but he wouldn't let that accusation slide. She had provoked him. She had been reckless with her words, and she had dared to doubt his devotion. He moved his hand slightly, his fingers splaying across her skin, his thumb brushing against her side. He felt the softness of her waist, the way she was so small and vulnerable against him. He knew that when morning came, the punishment would begin in earnest, not just for the drinking, but for the way she had looked at him with such cold suspicion this morning. She knew it was coming too. She was bracing for it, waiting for him to finally make her pay for the doubts she'd cast on their love. But for now, he simply tightened his hold, pulling her closer until he felt like he was shielding her from the entire world. He felt her shift in her sleep, a small, unconscious movement that brought her even closer to his touch, and a faint, satisfied smile touched his lips. He closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to drift off, but his hand never left her. Even in the depths of his own sleep, his grip remained firm, a silent, unyielding anchor that kept her exactly where he wanted her, held, protected, and entirely ready for the lesson he was going to teach her the moment the sun rose over Paris. To be continued.